And for more on the role of Observer Mission, we are now joined in live in our studios in Auckland Park by Olufunto Akinduro. She is the head of the elections and political processes at the Electoral Institute for Sustainable Democracy in Africa EISA. Good evening to you. Thank you so much for coming through.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, firstly, I think it's important for you to school us a little bit on your mandate really and what it entails.
Okay. Election observation has two sides to it. There's what you call citizen observation, which is really based more on the rights of citizens to participate in public affairs of their countries. So you would find South African citizens like the South African Council of Churches and some other groups, the South African Association of Lawyers and all that. These are citizen observers, and that's where their mandate comes from. As international observers, we have a slightly different mandate because the work we do is more of monitoring the international human rights framework. Also, a means of showing some level of international support for the process in a country and trying to contribute to citizens' confidence. There's something about when you go out and you are aware that there are other eyes, like a third set of eyes watching a process, that gives some level of confidence, and that's part of what we contribute to.
Yes, indeed. And of course, I assume that your role is not necessarily confined to the voting day only. You were telling me off air that some of your members have been in the country since the end of last month. So talk to us about that. When do you usually arrive in the country?
Okay, so as international observers, we fully understand that elections are processes. It's not an event, although, of course, the most obvious is that day when everybody goes out to vote. But for instance, in the case of South Africa, this is a process that has been on for 5 years. If you ask anybody in the IEC, they'll tell you the minute the 2014 elections were over, the plans for 2019 already started. So even as observers, we are conscious of that, and therefore our work, our assessment looks at it as a process. However, like you said, okay, so we've just been here, we came in April, but then we're going to issue a report that covers the entire process. How really do we do that? I mean, there's some level of research that goes into that. And the work we do starts from the basics of, number one, the legal framework. I don't have to be in South Africa to understand the legal framework of South Africa. The laws are publicly available. I also can follow the courts to know the kinds of judgments that have been issued, that have changed the legal framework. What are the new laws that have been passed ahead of the elections? We look at the laws, we look at the institutions, and then we now come to the procedures, which that's now the part where you can physically see what's going on.
Because the reality is we've seen on a number of occasions people have been complaining that observer missions, they would come, you know, just days before the elections, and soon after the elections they will leave. So how do they even get to a point where they compile a report? Because, for instance, in some countries we always see some contestations after the elections where, you know, there are disputes of the results and so on. And you find that the reports compiled by observer missions is always different to what is actually happening on the ground.
Well, so let's start from how do we capture the whole process. So I've talked about the aspect of doing the research. There's also different types of observation. You have the short-term observation, which you would find people staying from between 10 to 14 days. And you have long-term. We've had countries where observers stay on the ground for up to a year. But, I mean, these have budgetary implications. So you would have long-term observers that stay up to 2 months or 3 months in a country to cover the longer parts of the processes. That's from the campaigns up to the complaints and appeals, so that when these contestations come up, like you're saying, the observers are there, they can follow the court processes, and they can see how that unfolds. For us as EISA, because our head office is here, we've been on the ground. We deployed a mission in 2016, and for us, this assessment we are taking on is, you know, it builds on the findings of the 2016 municipal elections. So our work is not disjointed, so to say. It's been an ongoing process.
Of,
yes, and we may not be there continuously. So what we also do is to deploy like smaller missions at different aspects of the process. So we'll deploy what we call a pre-election assessment, like during the registration. In some countries, we could even do it if it's a country where the campaign starts very early. You would have a mission to go there like for a week. They write some report. they go back, and then by the time the big missions that you can see come, we have like a whole work ahead, I mean, on ground already that will build on. So there's a team, as you say,
for short-term and long-term processes.
Absolutely.
But your report, correct me if I'm wrong, is due to be released on Friday. And the official results are only coming through on Saturday. And if everything goes according to plan on Saturday, but we are also expecting that to happen on Sunday. So why do you
choose Friday
a report before the actual release of the results?
Okay. So first is to say international observers. I'm not talking of the partisan observers, but professional, independent international observers don't have any stakes in the outcome of an election. We are more interested in the process that leads to the outcome. Our practice is to issue what we call a preliminary statement. So what we're releasing on Friday is not the report. It's not our final report. It's a preliminary statement. And usually we clarify in that statement to say this particular assessment is up until the close of voting, or in our case, we would have observers in the provincial aggregation centers on the 9th. So at least we can also make some comment on that. However, our final report, we try to release about 3 months after. So at least that gives us time to follow the processes that come in the post-election period.
Yeah, even if there may be some disputes to the election results, so you are able to follow that up. So a very quick one on this, we have to wrap now. How would you rate participatory democracy in Africa in general in terms of the protection of human rights and perhaps that of democratic institutions?
Well, that's an interesting question because, I mean, Africa, I can't just say Africa in one fell swoop because we have countries at different stages in their democratic development. But I mean, if you go with indexes such as the Mo Ibrahim or the Freedom House, indexes that talk about the state of democracy, it's been interesting because one year you find us really progressing and then another year it will be, oh, democracy is stalling.
Yeah.
So, but my sense is that democracy is really difficult to give, you know, one sweep of the brush across a continent.
Yeah.
I would say you look at each country and its development as you go.
So it fluctuates in a way.
That's the truth.
Right.
I find it difficult to talk about
It's still
democracy.
difficult to say if we're there already. It's a process for the African continent, so you say. Well, we'll leave this conversation here for now. Hopefully we'll have you back after the elections to talk about your preliminary report. Thank you so much for coming through.
Thank you so much for having me.